Hello and welcome to the course Introduction to the Psychology of Language. I am Ark Verma from ID Kanpur and we are in the 5th week of the course. We are talking about sentence processing in this week. Last lecture we were talking about constraint based models of parsing. We talked about some of the effects that need to be taken into account while parsing system generates all of these multiple structures. We talked about the role of context, verb subcategory information, and also we talked about say for example, we also talked about some of the other factors as well. Today we will continue talking about the constraint based models of parsing. We will look at some of the other effects that need to be taken into account. One of those is the semantic effects in parsing. Now, in a general sense, people do not assume that semantics has to play a lot of part in syntactical structure generation or syntactical structure evaluation. However, the CBP models basically say that one of the sources of information that the parser should or does take into account is the semantic information associated with the specific words in the sentences. Now, this is almost in a sense counterintuitive to those coming from the Chomsky school of looking at grammar and syntax and how structure should be organized, but the constraint based parsers basically believe that semantics is also a very important source of information that needs to be taken into account if you are kind of creating multiple possible syntactical structures and then evaluating those structures against each other. Let us take an example. Let us have these two sentences. The defendant examined by the lawyer went to the prison. So, the defendant examined by the lawyer went into the prison. The defendant who was examined by the lawyer went to the prison. So, we have two structures here, two sentences here. The sentence 36 is lesser ambiguous because it is disambiguated by adding who was examined. Okay. So, 35 is called a reduced relative because it contains a reduced relative clause examined by the lawyer that modifies the meaning of the preceding the defendant. Okay. So, the defendant which defendant are we talking about? The defendant examined by the lawyer. You saw this was disambiguated in the next sentence, the defendant who was examined by the lawyer. So, that is actually the sentence, but in the reduced relative form you take away who was and you just say the defendant examined by the lawyer went to the prison. Now, the sentence can be made easier to process if we introduce the relative clause with the relativizer who was. In 36 the relativizer obviously gets introduced and it unambiguously makes the start of the relative clause and it kind of makes things easy. Now, numerous studies have shown that sentences like 35 are harder to process than sentences like 36. It might seem very easy to understand that now. The defendant examined by the lawyer went to prison, the defendant who was examined by the lawyer went to prison. Obviously, 36 is easier to understand. Let us see why. So, sentences like 35 are hard to process, alright, because the readers start to build a main clause type continuation. Okay, let us see what is a main clause type continuation. What is so? In general, reduced relatives are difficult to process because listeners have a hard time figuring out that they are dealing with a relative clause rather than a main clause. Okay. So, they kind of start with looking at that as main clause, main sentence, whereas that is actually a reduced relative that kind of gets attached to this one itself. So, why do they have trouble in identifying the relative clause? One reason is that the beginning of the reduced relative clause looks like a regular old main clause. Main clauses consist of grammatical subjects of the sentence, the main verbs of the sentence, and the arguments and modifiers that go in the sentence. So, typically it has everything that a main clause needs. Subordinate and relative clauses provide additional, so that is the main clause, basically main clauses have all of this. Subordinate and relative clauses provide additional information about the main clause or individual words that appear in the main clause. So, they do not have all of this information. So, while processing the defendant examined by the lawyer went to prison, listeners might begin to build a syntactic structure that is appropriate for a main clause continuation rather than treating that as a relative clause. So, if so, they would be ill prepared to deal with the actual continuation in 35, and then basically it could be easier if the actual continuation was more like this: the defendant examined the photographs. Okay. The structural choices parser faces kind of you can see here. So, the defendant examined and then by the lawyer, and the defendant examined kind of comes in the same sense by the lawyer went into the prison. So that's the difference. So these are the two structural choices, 38A and 38B. 38A shows the structure that you need for the main clause interpretation, whereas 38B shows the structure that you need for the relative clause interpretation. Notice that in structure 38B is obviously a little bit more complicated than the structure in 38A. So by the KANPUR theory, obviously 38B will be predicted to be harder. As a result, people should have trouble dealing with 38B because it has the more complicated structure. The CBP theory also predicts that 38B, 35 will be harder to process, or 38B will be harder to process, but it says for a different reason. How? CBP says that the problem of figuring out that examined is a part of a relative clause is made worse by the fact defendant refers to a person, but people are very likely to examine things. Now, so for example, the defendant is a person, okay. Generally you do not examine persons. I do not examine X, Y or Z person. I usually examine the pen, I would be examining the vegetables, I would be examining the fruits or the scene or something like. So usually people examine things but not actual real people. So because the defendant examined is there, so you kind of want to take it to a, you're looking for a different subject almost. Okay. So defendant falls into the category of animate things. Most of the time when a sentence starts with an animate entity, the animate entity is responsible for the action described in the sentence, because the defendant examined. So defendant it kind of leads to a new action, it kind of leads to a possible new action being generated. But here the sentence provides abundant structural cues that clarify the patient status of the noun defendant. Okay. So we know that the defendant is the one being examined and defendant is actually not doing anything. Okay. So here that will that should create a little bit of a problem. So again, looking at the theories, the CBP parsing theory would say when people hear the defendant examined by the lawyer went to prison, they would know that the defendant is animate. They would assume that the animate defendant will initiate some action. Okay, and examine provides them with the action that the defendant is initiating. So they will kind of, that is why be led on to expect a main clause type continuation. When they actually get to by the lawyer, all of those assumptions need to be re-examined, need to be undone. The defendant is not the initiator of the examined action, instead it is being examined. So that is a sort of a revision that needs to happen. On top of all that semantic revision, it turns out that the parser's structural assumptions are also wrong. It cannot be a main clause, it has to be a relative clause. This leads to errors on both accounts, semantics and syntax, leads to pure chaos. So the poor listener has been garden pathed in a major way and has to do a lot of work to clean up this mess. So let us see. Now looking at this again, as we saw that animate things are more likely to be agents rather than patients. So the following sentence in that sense might be easier to read. The evidence examined by the lawyer was complicated. Now evidence is inanimate and it can be examined. This is easier. So in this sense, evidence being inanimate is a good patient of examined. By using this semantic information about the initial noun, the evidence, the parser can avoid building a wrong structure. As soon as the sentence starts, the evidence examined by the lawyer, you know that this is an inanimate thing, it can be subject to examination, you will not create a wrong structure. Okay. But in the defendant examined, you thought that this is an animate thing, it will initiate action rather than being the object of the action. That is what will create problems. So this is basically something that one has to really understand, that the knowledge about what each of these words mean, the knowledge about the semantics is kind of important to take into account when parsing has to move ahead. Now another effect that we can take into account when you are talking about constraint based parsing models is the effect of prosody. Now we have talked a lot about prosody in this course, starting from the developmental part till other sections, say for example in word meanings and stuff as well, in speech processing as well. So what is prosody? Prosody is loudness, relative loudness, pitch, speed of speaking, and all of this that people kind of modulate while they are speaking. Okay. This speech information that identifies specific words is called segmental information, and this information that correlates with the grammatical and other discourse function is called suprasegmental information or prosody. So this information, which is also kind of correlating with the the other syntactic features, is called supra-segmental information. So there are two kinds of information. Again, let me repeat this. The speech information that identifies specific words is called segmental information, so pauses and other things. The information that correlates with the grammatical and other discourse function with respect to here I have to pay emphasis, here I have to not, is called supra-segmental information or prosody, the relative loudness, pitch and those kind of things. Now there can be two kinds of accounts of prosody. First is non-linguistic prosody. What is that? It consists of those parts of speech that provide cues to the speaker's general mental state. So whether you are happy or angry or depressed. So say for something like the tempo or the tone of the utterances, the excitement in the utterance, that is the non-linguistic prosody. It is just the superficial feature, it is the cosmetic feature, it is telling us about what the speaker is thinking about, what is its general emotional state. The second kind is the linguistic prosody, which has some linguistic function to fulfill. What is that? It consists of those aspects of speech that provide cues as to how the words are organized into phrases. You know about trochaic and iambic words. So greenhouse, greenhouse, greenhouse. Okay. So greenhouse versus greenhouse, the kind of difference in stress can tell you whether I am talking about a house that is green or I am talking about that glass structure which you can grow fruits or vegetables in, say for example that kind of thing. So nitrates or nitrates, those kind of things. Now prosody can also provide us cues that help the parser to construct correct syntactic structures. So say for example, in case the input is syntactically ambiguous and you do not really know how to organize this, the CBP model kind of says that people can take cue from the parser, from the prosody as well. Let us take this example. The professor said the student had on socks that did not match. Okay. Or the professor said the student had on socks that did not match. Also you can say the professor said the student had on socks that did not match. So it is either the professor is having socks that do not match or the professor is telling that there is a student that has socks that do not match. Pauses affect the meaning of the sentence and pauses are a good cue to phrase structure as well. So at least as far as spoken language comprehension is there. So again just let me read this. The professor said the student had on socks that did not match. So you can kind of get to two different structures here. However, such information is not available all the time, also not valid all the time, that is alright. But prosodic cues appear to strongly influence the interpretations of some of the sentences that you would that you usually have a globally ambiguous structure. Let us look at this. Susie learned that Bill telephoned after John visited. Susie learned that Bill telephoned after John visited. Susie learned that Bill telephoned after John visited, something like this. So you can kind of create multiple structures on the basis of pauses. Let me do it again. Susie learned that Bill telephoned after John visited. So Susie learned that Bill had telephoned after John had visited. So probably John told her that Bill had telephoned, or Susie learned that Bill telephoned after John visited. So Bill called after John had visited, or Susie came to know that Bill called after. So it can kind of lead to multiple structures on the basis of where you actually pause. Okay. Now this is obviously this is a globally ambiguous sentence. Depending on various places that I pause, I can create multiple possible syntactic structures, all of which are plausible, grammatically acceptable, but will lead to different meanings. Okay. So yeah. Alternatively, so if there is a relatively large pause between Bill and telephone, listeners are likely to judge that after John visited goes with telephoned. Okay, let us look at what is happening here. A pause after John visited could tell us that when Susie learned something about Bill, in which case the phrase after John visited attaches to the verb learned. Alternatively, the phrase after John visited could tell us when Bill telephoned, so it could then attach to the word telephoned. Or alternatively, if there is a relatively large pause between Bill and telephone, Susie learned that Bill telephoned after John visited, listeners are likely to judge that after John visited goes with telephone. Okay, so three possible interpretations are there. If there is a relatively large pause after telephone, listeners are likely to judge that after John visited goes with learn. So obviously, as I am saying, multiple things you can generate out of it. What is the point of this? Researchers have observed that naive participants who come into the lab, basically they, researchers brought these naive participants into the lab, and basically they were made to take part in a game. The game involved putting together pieces that came in different shapes and colors. So there were two kinds of participants. One was a driver, another was a slider, and the driver basically instructed the slider on how to move the pieces on a board. The trick was that the driver knew where the pieces were supposed to end up, but only the slider knew the location of the bonuses. So say for example, if you put this piece here, you get a bonus point, something like that. Now the driver and the slider needed to cooperate to earn points. The researchers elicited temporally ambiguous sentences from the participants by giving them a list of scripted sentences that they could use to play the game. So basically they come up with a list of sentences very cleverly, some of them ambiguous, some of them not, and they told the driver that you have to use these sentences to instruct the slider. On the basis of whether the slider correctly interprets the sentences, the game will move further. So let us take example of these sentences. When that moves, the square should land in a good place. When that moves the square, it should land in a good place. So you can see, again, on the basis of pauses, multiple structures can be generated. In this study, it was observed that the drivers spontaneously produced disambiguating prosodic cues that would help to disambiguate the sentences. So if the sentence were 42, when that moves, the square should land in a good place. But instead the speakers would actually say, when that moves the square, it should land in the good place. Okay. So it kind of already disambiguates. Okay. Now also then what happened, the researchers deleted everything after the word square and played the truncated sentences to a new set of participants. These participants were asked how the sentences would continue. Now what did they find was these new participants were also able to accurately predict what ending the original speakers would have used, and this indicates that the listeners were actually using prosodic cues and not really the word cues in order to choose between alternative syntactic structures. So this kind of serves as a very nice demonstration of the fact that people are very good at using these cues, the prosodic cues, in order to generate multiple syntactic structures and also evaluate the structures against each other. Now finally we can talk about visual context. See, a lot of our conversation happens in the world, it happens in a place, in a setting, and the setting has objects and elements. Now one of the things is that when we are talking to each other or when you are talking to somebody else, we are also conscious of the world. You remember we talked about point and say and mutual exclusivity and principle of contrast in a child picking up meaning, but adults also take cues from the visual context. We are talking about something and somebody says, okay, look at that, and you know exactly what this person is referring to. This kind of information the GPT was not really taking into account. The GPT said no, word category information and thematic processor will be sufficient to tell you the meaning of the word. The CVP slightly is more flexible and broader in its purview, and it says that the visual context of where the communication is taking place should also play a part in a person kind of understanding how or what is meant, or what kind of syntactic structures can be generated, and then evaluating them. So let's say let's take this sentence, the girl placed the apple on the towel in the box. Prosodically I can do a lot of things with this. The girl placed the apple on the towel in the box, or the girl placed the apple on the towel in the box. You can do different things with this. Now 46, this one is a garden path sentence because comprehenders interpret the first prepositional phrase on the towel as the goal of placing the towel initially, but then they realize that no, the goal is actually the box. Okay. To interpret the sentence as it was intended, comprehenders or listeners will have to attach the first prepositional phrase, the apple, as in which apple did the girl place. The girl actually placed the apple on the towel in the box. There could be other apples as well, and those apples could be somewhere else, but the girl actually picked up the apple that was on the towel and placed it in the box. That is what the sense you have to make. Now, in that case, on the towel is a source rather than a goal location. GPT says that sentences like 46 are very hard to process because the minimal attachment heuristic makes the parser adopt the wrong syntactic structure. What was the minimal attachment thing? It says that you have to kind of choose the simplest possible structure. Now, CPP says that and even the referential context theory says that sentences like 46 are hard to process, but because of a different reason. When the sentence appears by itself, nothing tells the listener that there might be more than one apple. Okay, and so there is no obvious reason to treat on the towel as the source, and that kind of leads to a problem. Okay, so as information that discriminates between the explicitly mentioned apple and some other unmentioned apples, so that kind of will lead to problems. We have seen that mentioning more apples in the story context, like we did with the burglar blew up the safe with a rusty lock, that case actually helps. Okay, so you've seen that mentioning more apples in a story context can make sentence like 46 easier to process. But is there another way to make this easier? Yes, the other way is that you kind of provide a context. Let us look at that. Now, to understand this kind of question, people like Mike Tannenhouse and his colleagues, they conducted a study where they manipulated what listeners were looking at, the visual context, as they listened and tried to understand sentences like 46. Now, they do a particular experimental paradigm that is called the visual world paradigm, and the visual world paradigm is basically the participant wears an eye tracking device that shows the researchers where they are looking during an experiment. So, typically I am wearing a head based eye tracker and I am kind of again reading these sentences. Real objects are placed on the table in front of the participant. So, I am kind of sitting on a table, there are real objects on a table, I am wearing that tracker and I am also reading the sentences. The participants are listening to the sentences about these objects and they respond to the sentences by moving the objects around. So, the girl moved the apple on the towel in the box and I have to do it. So, for example, please move the apple on the towel in the box, something like that, and I will have to follow the instruction, and the way I follow the instruction will tell you how well or poorly I have understood this. The researchers can manipulate the characteristics of both the visual display and the sentences, how the sentences are being read, and to see how basically participants' eye movements kind of go, where do they go. By analyzing the participants' eye movements, researchers can draw conclusions about how the participants would have interpreted the sentences, also by how I am moving it or versus how I am kind of moving my eyes around. When participants heard on the towel in put the apple on the towel in the box, they were more likely to look at the empty towel rather than the apple. So, look at here. So, this is the setup. This is basically on the bottom you can see the time and then you will see two scenarios. There is a box, there is a pencil, there is an apple on the towel and there is a towel that is empty. Put the apple on the towel in the box. So, what people are actually doing is initially participants heard on the towel, they were more likely to look at the empty towel rather than the apple. As soon as they hear on the towel, they think that okay, the apple has to be moved on the towel. Okay, so they kind of go with that. However, something really different happens when the visual display has more than one apple. Okay, so under these conditions what happens? When participants heard on the towel, they were more likely to look on the apple that was actually on the towel rather than looking at the empty towel. Let us look at how this really happens. So, here you have two apples and you have two towels. Okay, one apple is on the towel, one apple is on the napkin, and there is a box. So, when the people kind of are hearing this sentence in this kind of a scenario, there is, you see, no ambiguity almost. So, people kind of say that put the apple on the towel. So, the apple on the towel has to be put into the box rather than the apple on the napkin. So, under the conditions where there were two apples, when the participants heard on the towel, they were more likely to look at the apple that was on the towel rather than looking at the empty towel. So, what happens is, how did this happen? How did this come about? It seems that the participants were correctly interpreting on the towel in this case, because the visual context provided them a means to interpret that. Okay. So, when the display has two apples, the expression the apple itself kind of gets disambiguated by the following on the towel thing. Under these conditions, participants who are willing to build a more complicated syntactic structure, put the apple on the towel and on the box, is obviously kind of is going to lead you to a more complicated structure, so that they could attach on the towel as a modifier of the expression the apple, and in that case what happens is that the whole expression, the apple on the towel, is successfully picked up by the individuals, and it kind of leads to a sort of a disambiguating scenario. It is very easy to understand when the context is helping you to. Okay. That is predominantly a demonstration of how people kind of all the time use the visual context to disambiguate a lot of plausibly confusing syntactical structure possibilities. Okay. So, that brings me to the end of looking at the constraint based method of parsing. We have talked about at least 6 sources of information that can affect or that can modulate your syntactic processing. What are these? Frequency of the syntactic structure, we talked about that. Word meanings, animacy, inanimacy, grain size. Verb subcategory, we talked about that. Prosodic cues, we talked about that. Visual context, referential context, cross linguistic information. We talked about quite a few things which may have an important role to play on how we parse sentences. We had 2 theories. One was the garden path theory, simple 2-step 2-stage process, but does not take into account a lot of different kinds of information, and the other theory was the CBP model of parsing, which had so many of these information, all of which you can use simultaneously, parallelly, in order to resolve any of the ambiguities arising from syntactic structure. So, that is all from me about parsing. There is one more lecture left, and we will talk about some of the other factors continuing our discussion on parsing with respect to sentence comprehension. Thank you.